I would like to first thank the Elliott Museum for this wonderful opportunity to share with you our family's history and just some of the things that has happened with Martin County and our family. And especially thank you for Chessie, who just introduced me. She did the exhibit upstairs, and it's marvelous. And so if you haven't seen that, she says it comes down tomorrow. So this is your last chance. I'd also like to thank Sandy Thurlow, and I'll get to the reason in a few minutes. She's sitting here, and most of you know her. She's a great historian of Martin County. I'm going to start a little bit backwards. I'm going to start with Dad's retirement, and then I'm going to move back to when he was born. When he retired, he was 75 years old, and he had three main interests at that point. He still collected antiques. He and Mom would go places and come back with who knows what. One time, I think they even had to rent a van or something to bring what they brought back. And then after he got to the point he wasn't traveling much, he spent every weekend at the flea market where everybody knew him. And he collected many things. He also golfed, and he was a member of the Yacht and Country Club. He was a founding member, so he golfed there until he was 99 and a half years old. At which time, because he was on crutches, he figured that he couldn't golf anymore. And then his main interest, the main point of his day was doing his artwork. And he would sit out on the porch and paint all day. Well, he'd paint in the morning, and then he'd have lunch, then he'd paint in the afternoon, unless he was golfing. He started out by buying antique frames at flea markets and things like that, but it got to the point where it was rather expensive, so he started making his own frames, which he thought was kind of inferior to the antique frames. However, now most people want the frames that he built himself. He was sort of frugal, so he bought canvas by the roll. He stretched his own frames, made his stretcher frames, stretched his canvas, painted his paints, and then after he painted the pictures, he recorded in a book a little sketch of each of the paintings, the information about it, and in some cases what he thought he would sell it for. And we have several volumes of these. And he was very detailed. He also wrote and made books with his antiques, his tools, and his cut glass. One day he was coming in from the porch, and he came in and he sat down at the table, and I burst out laughing, and he said, "What's wrong? What are you laughing at?" I said, "Dad, you should see yourself." So I got a mirror, and this is really one of my favorite pictures of him. And it shows kind of how enthralled he was with painting. He would sit out on the porch and he would paint, and people frequently enjoyed coming to talk to him. And one of the people that came to talk to him was Sandy Thurlow. And every time she left, she'd say, "Curt, you need to write things down." And he'd say, "Okay." But of course, he was busy golfing and painting, and he didn't have time for writing. But one day, it was so cold and windy that he couldn't golf, and he couldn't sit out on the porch because it's a screened-in porch. So he sat down and he started writing, and he wrote 75 pages within the next couple days, or maybe 3 or 4 days. They were handwritten pages, and he said, "Okay." I said, "All right, I'll type it up." And he said, "Make 4 copies. One for you, one for your sister, one for your brother, and one for Sandy." And I said, "Dad, we need more copies than that." "Nah, we don't need more copies than that. Nobody will want to read my book." So anyway, I told Sandy he was working on the book, and so she immediately started telling people. And people kept saying, "I want a copy of the book." So I went to Southeastern Printing. I thought maybe we need 50 copies. And I got to Southeastern, and of course they set me straight right away. To print 50 copies, first I had to hire a graphic artist, and then I had to have them set up and run the cost of the book would be exorbitant if I just got 50. So I said, how many do I need that would be the minimum? And they said 500. So I said, okay. So I thought about it, and I went home and I told my dad, I said, I think I'm going to publish the book, but I need to borrow some money to do it. Dad was frugal. He said, there's no way you're going to make any money on the book, and you'll lose every cent you put into it. I'm not going to lend you the money. So I said, you're not? He said, no, that is not a good thing for you to do. So I went to the bank and I said, how much is a secured loan? How much is an unsecured loan? And how much are your CD rates? So they gave me the rates, and that was back, well, he was 96 years old at this point, by the way. So I went home and I said, Dad, I'm going to have to borrow the money from the bank. And if I get an unsecured loan, they're going to charge me 17%. Well, he went ballistic. And he said, what? And I said, well, if you sign for me, I think I only have to pay 10%. And I said, but you know, on your CDs, you're only making about 2.5% or 3%. He said, okay, I'll lend you the money at the CD rate. So anyway, we published the book. We got to go to Southeastern and watch it roll off the presses. And I had decided about the time that it was published that maybe we would probably try and do 1,000. Of course, Dad still thought it was a bad idea. And one night we went to the Stuart Heritage Club where he gave a talk. And every person in there had already talked to Sandy, so they came up and they said, we want a book. So we're riding home, I'm sitting there, I'm driving, he's sitting over, and he said, Laura Kay, how many books are you publishing? And I said, maybe 1,000. He said, well, how much would 2,000 cut the cost of the book? So we published 2,000 with overage, it was probably 2,300, and we've got about 200 left. So that sort of sums up Dad's philosophy as far as business and being frugal, but you know, seeing a different light at the end. Okay, my dad was born in New Jersey to a fisherman, and my grandfather fished during the summertime in New Jersey, charter fishing and commercial fishing. But during the summer or wintertime, the only job that he could get that was related to the ocean or the sea, because he was a true seaman, was oystering. And there were boats that went out of a little town called Bivalve, which I think is a great name for an oystering town. And they went out of Bivalve, and they would leave on Saturday or Sunday afternoon. They would be out until the next Saturday on the Chesapeake Bay in that horrible cold weather, pulling up oyster traps and shucking oysters, seeding the, oyster beds, and he didn't like it. So one day in 1917, a man came up to my grandfather and he said, there's this town in Florida called Stuart, and it is a great place. It is beautiful, it's on the water, and if you had a boat, you could probably fill up your boat with fish by 10 o'clock in the morning. And that's all it took. So that fall, my dad, who was 6 years old, and his two younger brothers, and my grandmother and grandfather came to Stuart. Now, they started out on a steamship that I think was supposed to go into Jacksonville, I'm not sure, but that's where it ended up because they ran into a hurricane. And the boat listed so badly that they got a Coast Guard to escort them in, and after they got in, my grandmother said, we're not coming by boat anymore. They got here, they came down by train. They got to Stuart, and that's sort of what it looked like. Now, these were plans by the Port Sewell Point Land Company of development. But if you can see right in that one little place, the only bridge across the river was the railroad bridge. There was no way to drive a car across the bridge. my grandfather had saved about $500, and he asked about buying a fishing boat. They said there was one in Jensen. So to get to Jensen, the only transportation he had was a bicycle. So he took his bicycle, rolled it across the railroad track bridge. I asked him what would happen if the train came. He said, I guess I'd have to jump. But anyway, he went up, he found a boat, came back, and he was in the fishing business. So from the time Dad was in first grade until the time that he graduated, they spent the summers in New Jersey. He would come here, he'd start school in New Jersey, but then he would come in the fall and they would go to school here. And then they'd go back in the summertime or late spring and fish in New Jersey. The first year Dad got here, he went into the schoolroom, and it was a multi-grade schoolroom. So as one of the younger students, he sat in the front. There was a door in the back, and the policy was if you had to use the restroom, you just walked back and walked out the back door and used the restroom, and then came back in and didn't disturb the class. So Dad walked out. When he came back in, the teacher stopped talking, and all the kids are looking at him, and he could not figure out what was going on. And so as he sat down, his teacher said, look at all the other students, look at their feet. All the students were barefoot. And she said, you make too much noise in those shoes. Don't wear those shoes to school anymore. So he became a Florida cracker really quick. When Dad was about 12 years old, he asked his father to get him some lumber to build a boat, because he wanted a little boat to run around the river in. So he built his little boat and used it for several years, made a little extra money because he would fish when he wasn't in school. And another person that came to the back porch to talk to Dad was Steve Hero. So when Dad was in his mid-80s, Steve came in, he was talking to him, and he asked him about his first boat. And Dad said, well, he built the boat, he remembered building it, he used it for many years, and then, he went off after he graduated. And Steve said, did you ever think about building another little boat like that? And Dad said, well, I don't have any use for it. And Steve said, well, I think it'd be kind of neat or something like that. 2 weeks later, Steve gets a letter, and Dad said, I've started your boat. And he built this little boat for Steve, and Steve used it for about 20 years. And that boat is hanging in the museum down, if you go down by the cars and go all the way down, that boat that he built, the last boat, of course, that he built, is hanging from the ceiling here in the museum. So that's kind of neat to look at, and it's neat to know that that's what happened to the boat. This is a few of the pictures of the early settlement when they moved here. And actually, this one is titled 1901, so it's taken from a picture that was close to when they got there. And this is the railway station where they shipped the fish, and we used to meet my grandmother when she came to visit. There was a Seminole population that would come into town at different times, and one lady had a pig, and so this is the Seminole lady with the pig. So Dad went to Bliss Electrical School and got a degree in electrical engineering, or whatever degree they gave, and went to work for Western Electric Company up in New Jersey. And in the meantime, back in Stuart, my grandfather was a handline fisherman, which meant he had lines from his boat with a lot of hooks in them, and they would haul them in by hand and then take the fish off. And he did that for many years, but a couple things were happening, and one of them was that the net fishermen were coming in. And this is a picture of some of the net fishermen drying their nets. The net fishermen became very prolific in catching fish, which drove the price of the fish down and made it not as profitable to be a handline fisherman. The other thing that was happening was tourists were starting to really come to Stuart in the wintertime. And this is Sunrise Inn, which is one of the places that they came. Bay Tree Lodge, and Knight Kiplinger is here tonight, and his family had Bay Tree Lodge. And this was another place where a lot of the tourists came. And then, of course, the Pelican Hotel also. Those were the three main ones, I think. These people were wealthy. And at the Sunrise Inn and Bay Tree Lodge, they offered things like you could go golfing at the little 9-hole golf course. I know at Sunrise Inn they had a little boat, small boat, and they would take people over near the House of Refuge in the river. They'd walk over to the beach, and then they'd light a fire and cook lunch for them, and the people could, roam the beach. But nobody had boats for people to go fishing in, and the men wanted to go fishing. So my grandfather was coming in at the docks, and this one man, Irving Bonbright, who was a financier from New York, kept coming over and saying, "Take me fishing. There's nobody that'll take me fishing." And Grandpa said, "My boat, which you can see here, is just a rough boat. There's not even anywhere to sit down. And it's bloody and guts and slimy, and all I'm doing is going out and catching fish." And that's my grandfather on the right, who wore a cap, smoked a pipe, and was just a great fisherman type person. And he would tell it like it is, and he kept saying no. And finally, Irving Bonbright talked him into it. And he thought, if I let him go, he'll just hate it, and he'll quit bugging me. Well, of course, guess what? Irving Bonbright loved going fishing. He said, "Keep taking me." Well, they finally struck up a deal, and Irving bought a boat. Well, he financed a boat that my grandfather paid off with the condition that Grandpa would be available every day that he wanted to fish, but he could use the boat for taking other people out or fishing himself, whatever he wanted, anytime that Bonbright didn't want him to fish. So that was really the start of the Whiticar fleet, because as soon as other people saw that there was a way to get out there, they were interested in chartering the boat. And my dad's two brothers graduated from high school, and so they got boats. Well, my dad was up in New Jersey, and he did not like working for the electric company. He was an ocean guy. He was not an electric, well, he worked for the telephone company as a subsidiary of the electric company. He had to go from town to town. He didn't have a car, so he had to find some way of getting there. And he said he was being paid $19.25 a week. And he could hardly make a living on that. So he called up my grandfather and he said, "I'm coming back." So he came back. This is a picture of he and my mom, and they got married in 1939. He came back, I think, in 1932, and got himself a boat, and they were in the boat business. This is some pictures of the early boats in the Whiticar fleet. And Dad, the Shearwater, which is the one on the right, Dad decided that our inlet is kind of treacherous, and so he could build a boat that would take the inlet better. So he built himself a boat, and that was the Shearwater. And eventually, my uncle wanted a boat. Well, my grandfather wanted a boat first, and so he was kind of building boats on the side, which was good because during the summertime, nobody would be down here for fishing, because until there was air conditioning, it was not a pleasant place to be for people from up north who were used to nice, cool weather. So the sail fishing industry got started. They started the Stuart Sailfish Club, which advertised Stuart as the sailfishing capital of the world. And then Dad designed a flag for them. We had postcards from one of the pictures Dad printed, and they sent out postcards all over the place. And the button on the right is a sailfish button. One of the things they decided was that for each sailfish caught, they would give a certificate and they would give a button. And the first set of buttons, if you got a sailfish over 8 feet, you got a gold button. If you got one from 7 foot 6 inches to 8 feet, you got under 8 feet, then you got a silver button. And if you got a sailfish under 7 foot 6 inches, you could get a bronze button. But the problem was you had to bring the sailfish in and have it officially measured. So we had at our house, because we had a lot of boats going out, we had a measuring stick, and it's under the sign that's there where they hung their fish when they came in. You can't see the measuring stick. But anyway, sailfish, you could either mount them or smoke them. And if you're an avid fisherman, how many sailfish can you put on your wall? You know, not many. Smoking them meant you had to pay for the smoking, and if you were just in for the day, that didn't happen. So a lot of the sailfish were really being slaughtered just so they could have a button. So they decided to make a release button, and that's what the bottom one is, and it says liberated because the sailfish could be released then. And all you had to do was have somebody on your boat vouch for the fact that you had caught a sailfish. So that was a way of conserving the sailfish. And Dad designed all the buttons and, of course, was a member of the club, as was probably, if you lived here a while, some of your ancestors were too. The St. Lucie Inlet was kind of a rough inlet. This is a picture of the Gannet, which was one of the boats that was built at Whiticar Boatworks, and it's running the bar, and sometimes it got really rough. One day there were charters scheduled, but the inlet was kind of rough, so the captains all offered the parties the option of canceling or running the boats down south and going out either the Jupiter Inlet or the inlet down by Palm Beach, or they could cancel. One of my uncle's parties canceled, but my dad and my grandfather and his brother Jack, all of them wanted to go fishing because they told him once you get out this inlet, it should be a lot better and we should have some good fishing. So they were going out and they got to the crossroads. Those of you that are familiar with the water road around here know that the crossroads lead down south toward Jupiter and West Palm. They got out there and they were turning, and another boat was coming and turned to go out the inlet, and it had a lot of people in it. So they got on their ship-to-shore radios and they said, "We advise you not to go out in that inlet." Well, the boat didn't listen, or the people on the boat didn't listen, so they went out the inlet. And a little while later, they got a call, "Mayday, Mayday." The boat had indeed capsized. There were 10 people in the water in life jackets. So my dad and my grandfather and his brother, my Uncle Jack, they turned their boats around. They took all the people that were on the 2 of the boats and put them on my grandfather's boat and brought them back into the dock. And my dad said to the mate, his mate, he said, "Look," he said, "this is going to be really treacherous. If you want to leave and also go in, I'll do it by myself." And his mate said, "Oh no, if you're going, I'm going." And one of the stories in the book was about the whole rescue. It took about 6 or 7, 8 pages to tell it. But the way that Dad described how he sat there and watched the waves till they got just so, and then, hit them this way and that way, it was amazing. So Dad got out there. He got 6 of the people out of the water. My uncle went out there. He got 2. And then another boat had appeared, and that was the Jean Dare, and that boat rescued one. So they were taking the people in, and one of the women on Dad's boat was saying, "My husband's still out there, my husband's still out there. Gotta go get my husband." So he put all of his people on probably my uncle's boat, went back out there. Unfortunately, by the time he found the man, he had drowned. They rescued 9 of them. And that's a picture. The Coast Guard gave them medals, the 3 captains' medals. The picture on the right, you probably can't see it, but in the center is a picture of the boat that was called the Nor'Wester that had foundered or, turned over. I don't think that this picture was taken on the day of the accident because the waves are not that high in the picture. But the boat, Nor'Wester, eventually washed ashore, and Dad salvaged it, and he rebuilt it, and it became part of the Whiticar fleet. And there were eventually 7 boats in the Whiticar fleet, and the Nor'Wester is the one on the far left. My grandfather had 3 boats, my dad had 2, and my uncles each had 1. So this was the Whiticar fleet. All right, Dad was building boats on the side, and in after the war, 1947, I think, Camp Murphy, which was formed, or is now Jonathan Dickinson, was an Army base. So there were a lot of buildings that were abandoned, they disbanded the Army base, so they needed to get rid of the buildings that were on the base. So they put them up for bid. My dad bid on the mess hall. Now that mess hall was big. It's a 2-story building. There were great big rafters and great big boards, all kinds of stuff in it. And the stipulation was if you bid on a building and got the bid, you had to remove it within 30 days. Now we're not talking, okay, let's bring in a crane, and we're not talking, let's call Brownie. So Dad got 2 small buildings and this big building, and he had to have it off the property in 30 days. So he arrived the next day with a pickup truck and 3 other men. And the guy said, you have to have this off in 30 days. And Dad said, yep.
Mr. 21.
Now, to me, of all the things Dad did, this to me confounds me the most, because they did get the building out of there in 30 days and resurrected it. This is the building on the property, and it still stands. They numbered all of the boards, and they sliced some of the things out, and I don't know how they did it. I have no idea. But this building was what he was going to build boats in. So they transported it down there from Camp Murphy. Soon after they got it set up, now this is Hurricane Jeannie, but soon after they got it set up, this is how everything looked prior to the hurricane. So in 1949, hurricanes were not named, and hurricanes were not given official Cat ratings. But everybody seems to think that this was a Cat 5 hurricane. By the way, Dad loved Vanna White. And we would watch Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy almost every night. And every night he'd pretty much comment on whatever Vanna had on. So this is what the boatyard looked like after the hurricane. So the hurricane upended boats. They ended up on the land, and it was a mess. My uncle, my mother's brother, John Dragseth, had that summer, and this happened in August, that summer my uncle and his new wife, Dode, had decided to come down to Florida because Dad had asked him to go into business with him. And so my dad and my Uncle Johnny were going to be business partners in Whiticar Boatworks. And my aunt said after the hurricane, she told my uncle, we're going back to South Dakota because there's no way they can stay in business after this. But I guess she didn't know my dad real well then, because Whiticar Boatworks did come into being, and this is kind of what it looked like after, I don't know, after they got well started. Whiticar Boatworks built 63 boats, and it started out being fishing boats. Eventually, the boats became more yachts. And this is one of the larger boats. Started out Aphrodite. That's Elegante when they renamed it. And then this is the red boat. This was my uncle's boat, the Hobo. And it was known all over because it was the only red boat around. And this boat, of course, was also one of the boats that my dad built, or the boat shop built, my dad and my uncle and everybody that worked for him. And at one time, the Boatworks had about 70 employees. I worked there, well, actually, I got my first job in that mess hall building when I was about 11 years old, sorting nails. And I think my dad paid me about 9 cents an hour. One time later, I got a job scrubbing down in one of the boats, scrubbing down in kind of the down below, and I think I got 35 cents an hour then. During my sophomore year in high school, I got a job at the boat shop, more secretarial, and I got paid 50 cents an hour then. So I had quite a bit of time working with the boat shop. Many people worked at the boat shop. I still have people that come up to me and say, oh yes, I worked at the boat shop such and such a year, and I think that my dad and my uncle treated their employees very well, or at least that nobody's ever told me anything different. My dad was he wanted things done right, but if you did things right for him, he was very happy and would be glad to tell you so. If you didn't do things right, he would also tell you. He would give you a chance to correct it, but after a while, if things didn't happen, you were probably better working somewhere else. And this is a picture of my dad and my brother. My brother and my cousin, my Uncle Johnny's son, when my dad and my uncle retired, they took over the business. And at that time, there were 3 different locations. There's one in Fort Pierce that we at that time called Whiticar North, and there was the Whiticar right beside our house, and then Whiticar Boatworks beside our house, and then there was Shearwater, which was a mobile unit. Eventually, John and Jim decided to split the business, and so John got the business beside our house, which has now become HMY, and Jim kept the other 2 and renamed them Shearwater. And Shearwater was actually a name that Dad had picked to be the name of his line of boats, and that was kind of what he wanted them to be called by, but everybody just called them Whiticar Boats. So anyway, so it's nice to know that the Shearwater part is still going on. Here are a few of the additional paintings. Like I said, when Dad retired, he painted. He was always very interested in history. And most of you know the Treasure Coast, which is what we're called. It's called that because there were a lot of boat wrecks. And this is his rendition of one of the boat wrecks. In fact, he's painted, I think, 3 pictures of this particular boat, the J.H. Lane. Hopefully you've been to the House of Refuge, and you know that when the boats wrecked, that they could come to the House of Refuge. They had a keeper, and there were places for them to stay. If you haven't been over there, it's really interesting. This is a picture that he painted of the South Fork, and I think this picture is taken from a photograph that Ernie Lyons made. I know Ernie Lyons took a party out one day, and it might have been a picture that Dad just made from Ernie Lyons. Ernie Lyons was the original editor of the Stuart News and was very much part of historic Martin County. This is just a painting of the big oaks out by the hammocks, and Dad did a lot of interior Florida paintings also. In fact, he did a lot of paintings, period. As he got older, his paintings got a little less detailed and a little more impressionistic. And this is one of his paintings of the Atlantic coast sunset. He liked sunrises and sunsets. One of the things about my dad was he knew a lot about a lot of things. We would sit in the house and he would hear a bird call and he'd call back to it, and the bird would answer him a lot of times. And he also knew what kind of a bird it was from the bird calls. When I was in 8th grade, I was doing a report on constellations, and he took me outside and showed me the constellations. It seemed like whatever came up, he would know something about. Of course, he knew fish, he knew the ocean very well. Back in the day, they did not have all the equipment they have now, so when they went out, they used a compass and whatever landmarks they had. And sometimes we'd go out and we'd be out of sight of land, and I'd be like, how are you gonna get back? Well, he'd get back in sight of land, he'd sight up where the trees and whatever marks they were, and back we would come. He had certain secret fishing spots, and he did not tell the other charter fishermen about his secret fishing spots. Not even his dad, I don't think. And people would say if Curt Whiticar couldn't find the fish, they weren't going to find them either. But he had wrecks and just different things that he would navigate by. And as I said, he did seem to gather a lot of information, and at night when we'd watch Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, he would say the answer before, they showed him. And I'd say, Dad, how do you know that? Oh, I don't know, I just knew that. And he watched a lot of National Geographic, and he watched a lot of history. He was a very well-rounded person, very knowledgeable. Our family vacations were few and far between because he said, you've got the ocean, you've got a golf course, what more do you need? You don't need to go on vacation. But we did go to Sanibel Island a few times, and that was a lot of fun and something that I remember. And again, thank you so much to the museum. This has just been so much fun, kind of nerve-wracking, but a lot of fun to prepare for this. I just went up to take one last look at the exhibit because Chessie did such a great job of putting it together. Thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure.